Will now come to order. It is November 3rd, 2021. May we have roll call?
Valerie Ritz.
Present.
Clayton Walker.
Present.
Kevin Cross.
Present.
Don Porter.
Present.
Jenna Weltzine. Present. Karen McGillivray.
Present.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Thank you. May I have a motion to approve the action summaries from Wednesday, October 6th, 2021? Kevin Cross has moved. Karen McGillivray has seconded. And is there any opposition to approving the motion? Seeing and hearing none, the motion passes. We'll next turn our attention to the minutes from Wednesday, October 6, 2021. May I have a motion to approve the minutes? Jenna Weltzine has moved and Kevin Cross has seconded. Are there any changes, amendments, modifications, or additions that need to be made to the minutes? Seeing and hearing none, is there any opposition to approving the minutes? Seeing no opposition, the minutes are approved. We'll next turn to special order of business. Are there any disclosures on tonight's agenda?
I need to.
Yes, you have the floor.
I need to disclose that I need to abstain from voting on agenda item B1 under action summaries, as I was not in attendance last month.
Okay. The record will reflect that you were abstained on the vote on that action summary. Are there any additional disclosures? Seeing and hearing none, we will now move on to informational items. We have informational items from September 27th, 2021, October 4th, 2021, October 18th, 2021, and October 25th, 2021, along with the revised edition issued 11/3/2021. The Platting Board meets each month on the first and third Wednesday, except holidays, as regular meetings. If the Platting Board fails to complete its agenda for its regular meeting, the Board will carry over the remainder of the agenda to the following meeting. The procedure by which the public may speak at this meeting is as follows. After the staff's presentation is complete on a public hearing item, I will ask for public testimony on an issue. People that wish to testify will follow the time limits that are established in the Commission Rules of Procedure. Petitioners, including their representatives, are given 10 minutes. They may reserve part of their time for rebuttal. Representatives of groups, community councils, PTAs are given 5 minutes, and individuals have 3 minutes. When your testimony is complete, you may be asked questions by the Board. You may only testify once on an issue unless questioned further by the Board. Any individual may have appeal rights relating to any action this Board takes. Appeal of this decision or any condition is governed by Anchorage Municipal Code 21-11-304. The decision of the Board at the scheduled public hearing becomes final 7 days after we make a decision on the record, unless a written request is submitted to the Planning Division prior to the expiration of the 7th day to prepare a written decision based on the record made at the hearing, and the request is accompanied by a written notice of intent to appeal. Adoption of the written decision by the Planning Board becomes the final appealable decision within 20 days of the final appealable decision. An interested party must file with the municipal clerk either a written motion alleging new evidence or changed circumstances under AMC 21-11-503, or an appeal of the Board's final appealable decision under AMC 21-30. With that, we will now turn to new business and public hearing item case 2021-120, Municipality of Anchorage. May we have the staff's presentation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Assemblymember John Weddleton presented Assembly Ordinance 2021-74 to amend Anchorage Municipal Code Title 21, Chapter 8, Section 050 Improvements and Section 060 Subdivision Agreements to clarify soil contamination cleanup requirements for new subdivisions within the municipality. This text amendment will establish cleanup standards for contaminated soils discovered during the subdivision process. Title 21 does not currently have a defined level at which contaminated soil must be restored to. The remediation of contaminated soils is regulated by the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation under standards within state regulation. This code amendment will codify those standards and provide consistency between municipal and state soil remediation requirements. It will also protect residents and utility ratepayers by reducing known and unknown costs associated with excavation activity within contaminated soils when installing and maintaining public facilities and utilities. The Planning Department has reviewed the proposed ordinance. We do recommend approval with the following amendments, and those amendments will remove unnecessary language, it will ease reading, and it will provide consistency in code structure. Those amendments are shown on page 2 of the staff report, and my apologies to the board. I didn't include in my staff report an explanation of what this legislative language looks like in formatting. But anything that is capitalized and within brackets is proposed to be deleted. Anything that is underlined is an addition. So it does appear at first glance that we're taking a substantial cut out of the proposed ordinance by deleting quite a bit of language here, but much of it is just simply not necessary. I suppose I can go line by line here, but the language as may be updated or amended, we're proposing to remove that because it's assumed that regulation and law is going to be updated and amended as necessary. Also, and utilized by the State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. We're proposing to remove that because it's understood that those regulations are utilized by the state. Any cleanup required under this section will be consistent with the Arctic and Western Area Contingency Plan. That plan is not utilized by the Contaminated Sites Division at Department of Environmental Conservation. That is used by spill response, so it's not applicable here in this case. And the next sentence, approved by AEDC and approved only at a level that will not require institutional controls. So this is quite a confusing sentence. It almost suggests that the municipality has some say into whether or not institutional controls could be placed upon a property, but that's not the case. The only individuals that can make that determination is DEC. And also the cleanup standards that are referenced on the third sentence of the proposed language requires cleanup to a standard that would not require institutional controls anyway. So this language just doesn't appear necessary. And we would like to add an addition at the end here, or as otherwise deemed appropriate by DEC, if in the opinion of DEC they feel that a different regulation standard is necessary. For Section 2 of the proposed AO, our recommended amendments are quite simple. We're just recommending that we replace the word prompt with the word timely, and that's simply because prompt is not used in Title 21, but timely is. We also contemplated adding some type of time requirement, whether that's 15 days, 10 days, 12 days, but we would prefer to leave it up to the subdivision agreement to determine exactly what would constitute timely notice, because then it could be more specific to the requested hand and situation. But with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that the board may have. Thank you.
Does the board have any questions for staff at this time? I've been involved in a few of these cases where rather than cleaning up, a state has been willing to allow a developer to encapsulate environmental problems. Is this requiring everything to be cleaned up and it's not allowing the encapsulation process?
So through the chair, that's a great question. I'm not an expert on soil remediation. However, to my understanding in my discussions with DEC staff, certain methods like encapsulation or restrictions on use or signage or regular monitoring of a site, those I believe would fall under institutional controls, which would not be allowed under this ordinance. Everything would have to be cleaned up to a level that would not necessitate the use of institutional controls.
Well, I don't know about anybody else on the board, but I would favor not approving this.
Through the chair.
Go ahead, you have the floor.
So, I can relive a personal experience and kind of maybe help shine some light on where this might be a concern. I would say it was about 5 years ago, I purchased a HUD home. And the HUD property, the federal government is actually not required to disclose known contamination issues when they sell a property. They're exempt from disclosure issues. So I bought this property even though they knew it had a buried heating fuel tank that apparently had been cleaned up and tested and found not to have any leaks. But when I purchased it, the DEC came through and said, although there's no signs of contamination, we want you to provide additional testing. And 2 years later, and about $80,000 of continued testing with no end, I finally was able to resolve it. But they did so begrudgingly. Couldn't find any testing under the house. Had me bring in a hydraulic rig, cut down 2 birch trees, this big black sprig, to test at all possible angles everywhere. They still weren't satisfied because they said there could be contamination somewhere. And I don't want to see this happen to anybody. I don't want to see an agency that has no authority and has no oversight run amok when all they see is a way to bilk somebody for money indefinitely. And that is how does that address those issues to where they can just simply say, well, it's not good enough? Even if you have clean soil samples, if you said you have to read a specific amount, I could see that. But I will tell you from personal experience, I'm not willing to give them any more leeway than they already have because it's already very loose. So is this giving them more control and less and less options to the public? Because at that point, I'm an emphatic no.
Yeah, the problem I have with it is this isn't giving any more power to the state than it already has. This is just giving the developers 2 agencies that they wind up having to go coordinate with, both the city and the other. And then in order to be in compliance with the city, part of the methodologies that are allowed at the state level or the federal level are being eliminated by the city ordinance. I think, go ahead, you have the floor.
Through the chair, maybe a clarification from staff. What you see in bold caps are being deleted, is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
So what we are doing is we're saying that it shall be regulated by the Alaska DEC or its successor shall be cleaned up in accordance with the standards, and then basically period, or otherwise deemed appropriate by DEC. And what we're deleting are discussions that you will not require institutional control. So it's basically it's deleting the requirement to clean up everything, correct?
Through the chair, that's correct. And I could probably clarify some of the confusion here. So the municipality has no interest in getting into the contaminated soils cleanup business. That is DEC's authority. That is their jurisdiction. What this ordinance does is it simply states that the municipality has to abide by these standards within state regulation. And the standards within state regulation exist regardless if this ordinance is approved or not.
And again, to clarify, it's actually cleaning and clarifying that the city is not requiring anything greater, any standard greater than what's required by DEC.
Through the chair, that's correct. It will provide consistency and predictability for the development community.
Thank you. So I guess does that clarify some of the questions that you have?
I guess I'd like to see what it'd be nice to know what the problem was that we're solving if I knew an example of a case where this created an issue, so I could put in perspective. Yes? Oh, it'd be interesting to know the case that brought this up or what the problem was created with the current structure. Is there an example of a frustration that we're resolving?
So through the chair, this ordinance did not originate from the planning department. It originated from the assembly, who received a complaint from a constituent that they were held to a stricter standard than state regulation in order to clean up contaminated soils within a subdivision. The area of contamination was going to be dedicated municipal right-of-way, of which the municipality was going to take possession of it. And the municipality chose to hold them to a higher standard for soil contamination cleanup because the municipality would then be the owner in perpetuity.
Oh. Okay.
And the developer disagreed with that reasoning, so they approached Mr. Weddleton to draft this ordinance.
So in that particular case, he had cleaned it up to DEC standards, but to the state, it wasn't enough.
The city.
And so you had conflicting, and so I do everything you tell me to do, and then I find out it's not enough on the backside, so.
The city held a higher
Yes,
standard.
wanted a higher standard, because they're gonna adopt the property, but they're gonna be the owner. So, which then begs, if they're going to be the owner, do they have the right to say, I want it done at a higher standard? If you're going to be the purchaser, if you're in contract to buy a piece of property, and the seller's required to clean it up, wouldn't they, if you're going to be on the hook of it, wouldn't you want the right as a public individual to hold them to a higher standard? Or since you're the one who's going to be liable for the risk associated with it? Or do you have to buy the property if they clean it up to DEC standards? Wouldn't the general public have the right to say, no, I want a higher standard?
Well, through the chair, I mean, you could do your own due diligence and get an environmental phasing done, but I actually had a different point of order. Did we open this up for public comment? Public hearing?
Oh,
We're still asking questions.
We're still asking in the
still
staff
asking
report?
questions
Okay,
of the
it
board.
sounded like we were in board debate, so I just wanted to make sure that we were on the right
Yeah, we're
track.
trying to see if we've got all the questions.
Okay.
I want to make sure I understand I'm voting on.
That's always a good thing.
Yeah,
So-
all right, but excellent.
Yeah, let me put the two things that you put out there in buckets. The first bucket is anybody buying anything, whether it be the city or any other entity, they have the right to negotiate
Yeah.
what they're buying. Regardless of city or state standard, if they want something greater than city or state standard, they have the right to negotiate that. That's bucket one. The other bucket is this ordinance. This ordinance, as written, before any modifications, actually requires a higher standard of care than DEC. There are two rules. There's the municipal rule and there's the state rule. Because the stuff they're deleting is the higher standard. They don't allow institutional controls where DEC might.
Okay.
And what they are proposing to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they are saying we want to take away the two standards and live by the DEC standard.
All right, excellent.
That's my understanding of this. Is that correct?
Through the chair, again, the ordinance did not originate with the planning department, but I do believe that that was the original intent by the drafter of this ordinance.
Thank you.
With that, we'll go ahead and open the matter for public. Is there any members of the public that are going to weigh in on this? Do we have anyone calling in?
Dustin Darden. Could I use part of my 3 minutes to ask you a question?
Can we, Dustin Darder, D-A-R-D-E-R?
Dustin Darden,
Darden.
D-A-R-D-E-N,
And where are you located?
Anchorage,
Okay.
Alaska. From what I'm reading, it says case 2021 review and a recommendation of an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code section 21.08.050 and 21.08.060 to adopt a cleanup standard for contaminated soils for new subdivision applications. So, rather than go over the contents of what you're proposing here, my observation was through, I believe, a municipal employee. This gentleman here was saying that this would be enforced regardless if it was adopted into the municipal code or not. So what would be the purpose of putting it into the code? And then what possible ulterior motives may be implicated in this municipal code section 21.08.045 amendment and 21.08.060. You may be aware that the Agenda 2030 is has been fast-tracked, and we need to be extra diligent in the prevention of globalization of our United States of America here in Anchorage, Alaska. So I find it important that the public process be thoroughly reviewed and that any measures that were brought to you primarily from a tyrannical vice chair from the Anchorage municipality of Anchorage, just on contact from the vile nature of this human being, Christopher Constant, through the chair, Mr. Walker, Christopher Constant is a tyrant, and the fact that he proposed this case 2021-0120 RY, I would implore you to shred the document, anything that he's ever touched, any communication he's ever given to you, or any of the tyrannical assembly, because they are being federally indicted for crimes against humanity, violations of the Nuremberg Code, conspiracy against rights, interference with constitutional rights, and they're going to have a trial in Fitzgerald Federal Courthouse, and any association had it with them in the past, I'd implore you to cease and desist so you're not implicated in these crimes.
Thank you.
Hi, Dustin, I got one little follow-up for you. It's actually being brought by Assemblyman John Weddleton.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. He's also a tyrant.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
I appreciate that. Thanks for clarifying, though.
You're welcome.
And thanks for looking out for the public process, making sure that we had time to speak in your new election. I appreciate you.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other members who would like a question to Dustin Darden? Seeing none, are there any other members of the public that are here that wish to be heard on this matter? Seeing and hearing none, we have no one to call in. Okay, with that, now the matter rests with the board. Well, we don't have... Did you have rebuttal that you wanted to offer?
I do not.
And does the municipality have a representative that wanted to address rebuttal?
Mr. Chair, we do not.
Thank you. With that, the record will reflect that the matter now rests with the board. So may I have a motion to approve the text amendments to Anchorage Municipal Code Title 21? It's been moved by Don Porter. Do we have a second? Jana Welton has seconded the motion. Don, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yes, I move that we accept the revisions proposed in the recommendation for Section 1 of 28.08.50 and Section 2 of 21.08.060 as proposed. I will be supporting this amendment and following the reviewing agencies have reviewed these amendments and they have no objection to the amendments. I personally find that these amendments clean up the code and remove a double standard and default to the DEC standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members that would like to add their thoughts and findings? Kevin Cross, you have the floor.
I'm still concerned about this paragraph on page 7 through 17. So this ordinance makes, so when it's referring to this ordinance, is it the existing ordinance or is it talking about the ordinance that we're changing it to? This site cleanup standards, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this properly. This ordinance makes clear the municipality would not accept cleanup that requires institutional controls. Generally, less stringent cleanup levels are available under an alternative method if the developer demonstrates compliance with institutional controls. Institutional controls by law must be appurtenant and run with the land, require the owner to enforce the prohibition of certain activities, and require deed and zoning restrictions, and include a grant to the ADC of a perpetual right to enter for monitoring, testing soils, and inspection of the site and records. For those reasons, it is undesirable for the municipality to receive by dedication in a subdivision plat some cleanup areas burdened with institutional controls. It would not be allowed by the proposed ordinance. So I'm just making sure I understand what those ramifications are and how that affects the public. It seems to me like what it's saying is that if there's a DEC approved, less stringent cleanup alternative, that the municipality is saying that's no longer allowed, or at least if there's institutional controls. It's eliminating that option. So it's either got to be completely cleaned up, but it can't have monitoring stations, it can't have test wells, it can't be tested. It's either all or nothing. You know what really frustrates me with this? You know who the number one contaminator of soils is? The state of Alaska, the railroad, and they're not doing anything. That's very frustrating as a real estate developer, that here we are with laws that affect the public, but we know that they're sitting on a ton of sites down by the railroad they haven't done anything with in decades. So I'm inclined not to vote for this just because based on that paragraph, it sounds to me like we're putting additional restrictions on the public and what they can do to clean up and what they can do while the state sits here and does nothing with all that contamination site down by Ship Creek.
So, permission to,
Proceed, Don Porter.
so what it's clearly saying now as we're discussing, shall be cleaned up in accordance with AAC. So there is no opportunity for institutional controls, is what it's saying. And so that's going, and if you have to clean it up, then there's no opportunity to put IC, they call them ICs, institutional controls on a piece of property, so that a person down the line purchasing the property has to deal with it. That's what institutional controls do. So they're just saying it shall be cleaned up per DEC.
Yeah, there's several, excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah, there's several of those out there. I mean, the Tesoro station that sits on Spinard, it's got monitoring wells on there, that's got institutional controls, and then they sell it. For the life of that property, Shell Oil is on the hook for its cleanup indefinitely and monitoring that for like another 12 years. Although it's shown clean, they're still on it for another however long they got to. So what I'm understanding is, in a situation like that, it's got to be completely cleaned up.
Yes.
No institutional controls.
And this ordinance did that before, and now they're just cleaning up the language to say that it shall be cleaned up. They're not allowing institutional controls in the statement. They're just saying, so the language is the same. It's just saying it in a clearer way is what I'm reading here. That would be my assertion.
So as it sits right now, you're saying there's no option for institutional controls?
Yes.
They're not allowed.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
They're not allowed any form.
They weren't allowed before, and they're not allowed in this language either.
Mr. Chair, can I make a comment, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Ryan Yell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to point out, too, that there's a benefit to requiring a cleanup to a level that doesn't require institutional controls, because if it does become municipal property, if it's right-of-way, if it's a park parcel, something like that, if there's any burden of paying for monitoring, maintaining monitoring wells, maintaining signage, restricting access, that burden would now fall on the municipality, i.e. the taxpayer, who then has to fund the monitoring of that contaminated area that should have been cleaned up by the previous owner. So that is one reason why we do not feel that institutional controls should be an option for property that could become municipal property in the future.
Mike? So this only applies to properties that could become municipal property?
Through the chair, this would apply to all land within a subdivision within the municipality.
Yeah, so if I understand, basically, the municipality is taking the position that because it's possible, some of that land might be conveyed to the municipality in the future, but even if it's not under the subdivision plan, that the areas that aren't planned to be transferred are going to have to be cleaned up. They can't be encapsulated like they are now, where you stick them under a parking lot or you stick them under a large building.
Through the chair, that's correct. Yeah, the developer would be required to clean it up.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in before we take a vote?
I'd like to say one other. So, to be clear, they didn't allow ICs before this amendment. This amendment clearly did not allow ICs. And now with the new amendment, it still doesn't allow ICs. So there's no change in the status quo.
Yeah, then,
Language.
so what's the impact? I mean, what was the impact to the developer in the example that Mr. Yell gave about why this was brought forward? I guess I'm having a hard time understanding what this is doing other than cleaning up language, but cleaning up language wouldn't have made a material impact on the developer situation that Ryan explained earlier. So what are we doing here?
Through the chair, Ms. Welton, so these two sections would be brand-new sections within Title 21. There's no mention of soil contamination in Title 21 right now, but what it would do is it would incorporate and set standards. It would codify the state standards within municipal regulation.
And you know, I always hate that because when the state standards change, then you guys are out of compliance, and I see it in my industry all the time. So I'm trying to support this. I know I seconded it. I'm just trying to understand why the benefit is. So
through the chair, I'll do my best to kind of convey what the original intent of this ordinance was, but you are correct. I mean, this is state regulation. It's going to be effective regardless of what occurs, and whether the Platting Board decides to support this ordinance or not. It's in state regulation. The original intent, based upon my understanding, is that the developer would have liked some type of predictability and consistency as to what would be expected of them as far as cleanup standards. So they approached Mr. Weddleton to draft this ordinance with the intent that would provide that consistency and predictability to the development community.
But shouldn't they have just looked to the state code? Okay, all right, well, I am going to be a no vote on this. That's my position.
Is there any further discussion? If not, then we'll call the vote. Looks like the motion has failed.
We have a different understanding of it.
I'm just, what I read.
So that brings us to the conclusion of our meeting, and we stand in adjournment.
I read it different than you do.
Yeah, I would never buy a piece of property with ICs on it.